co-founder and chairman of Academic Rights Watch, which is an independent private foundation monitoring academic freedom in Sweden. We started in 2012 because we were interested in this development. And we saw signs that things weren't working in the way they should be working. And we started actually documenting cases where we think that the academic freedom has been violated. Having said that, I should also say that Sweden is in the international forefront when it comes to implementing various policies that are commonly perceived to be progressive. And it's therefore looked upon with admiration by observers from other countries, eager to copy Swedish achievements in this regard. And my examples of academic freedom will, I hope, highlight the flip side of those policies when they are essentially forced upon academia. I don't want to suggest that progressive agendas in general are worse than conservative ones from an academic perspective. It's more the implementation I'm concerned with. So the idea of forcing a certain view of things on academia. So that's my main target here, not the progressiveness in general or conservativeness in general. So in my view, academic freedom is not a left-right political issue at all, but should appeal to all members of a democratic society. So after having commented on the root, what I take to be the root causes of these violations, I end with a more philosophical discussion of the particular role of radical relativism in undermining academic freedom, and also the extent to which such relativism cannot all be coherently pursued within academia. And here I stick out my neck voluntarily, so you can criticize me if you wish, but that's my view of things. Let me start with the two case studies. In September 2018, Academic Rights Watch reported on the case of Professor Heslow, who was at the time a professor of neurophysiology, but also an associate professor of philosophy at the Swedish university, a major Swedish university. And Professor Heslow's course on heredity and the environment was criticized by a student for being in possible violation of the department's discrimination and equal treatment policies. And these are policies that are in turn derived from other policies higher up in the university hierarchy. So there's in particular something which is called the gender mainstreaming plan. And following the criticism, the chairman of the medical program urged Professor Heslow to apologize for certain formulations regarding the biological basis of homosexuality and transsexuality. Upon Professor Heslow's refusal to do so, the leadership decided to open an internal investigation into charges of discrimination and harassment on behalf of Professor Heslow. While by the way, I mentioned the names because this Professor Heslow has been open about this case himself, and also the other case I'm discussing with Professor Lecturer Ringmar, or Dr. Ringmar, is also a case where that person has been himself commenting in public on the case, so it's not a secret who they are. But anyway, while the investigation actually acquitted Professor Heslow of any wrongdoing, it also states that there is nonetheless risk of discrimination. He was acquitted of the charges, but there's still a risk for discrimination according to the university. So its recommendation is that the faculty should take the action it deems necessary to reduce this risk. And we will see later what those actions were supposed to be. Now, in the commentary, Professor Heslow denounced the decision to open a formal investigation in the first place. He was very much opposed to this idea that he should be investigated for something. And he wrote and complained very clearly here, so quote, "Each one of us who in the future considers lecturing about subjects that can cause strong emotions or saying things that some students won't wish to hear now has to consider the possibility of being subjected to considerable discomfort and public investigation using completely different standards than those usually applied when evaluating lectures," unquote. In a letter to Professor Heslow, the faculty dean reported a number of new gender strategies introduced by the faculty. Among them are certain terminological requirements. And here's a quote from the dean. "With regard to the criticized lecture, the program management has already informed you of the correct terminology regarding gender identity and sexual orientation," unquote. Furthermore, quote, "In order to broaden the perspective, your lecture will be supplemented with a lecture on perspectives on gender in medical science," unquote. So this was, the lecture was part of the medical program, and now they wanted to introduce a further lecture which in a way commented on the Professor Heslow's lecture.
Sorry, Prof. Olsson?
Yes.
Sorry to disturb you, but we're not seeing a presentation. Just click on so that we can view your presentation?
Yeah, I haven't really started the presentation.
Oh,
but,
okay, sorry.
It will come in a moment.
Okay, thank
So the
you.
faculty's dean's allusion to the correct terminology refers to Professor Heslow's claim. This was made in passing in response to a student's question in the Q&A section of his lecture. That, quote, homosexual women have a male sexual orientation, unquote. And with regard to transsexuality, that, quote, whether it's a sexual orientation is a question of definition, unquote. So this was what the Professor Heslow claimed during his lecture. And these formulations were criticized by the program chairman for, more precisely, not respecting, quote, the terminology as defined in Swedish law, unquote. And here there was a reference to the Swedish Discrimination Act, which is a part of the law which protects against discrimination. Now, regarding transsexuality, it's worth noting that according to the Discrimination Act, it is not a sexual orientation. So the latter are defined as homosexual, bisexual, or heterosexual orientation. So transsexuality is not defined as a sexual orientation in the Discrimination Act. Professor Heslow then complains in a written response to the complaining student that his statement alluded to the fact that there are, in his view, scientific grounds to believe that, quote, it's not possible to draw any strict borders between transsexuality, gender dysphoria, and homosexuality, unquote. And in that case, of course, it becomes a matter of definition. So from his perspective, I mean, it was a matter of definition from a biological perspective. But I don't want to take any stand on the factual issues here, so because I'm interested in the academic standpoint on this. And I believe that from the academic standpoint, the very notion that the Discrimination Act or any other law enacted by the people's representatives in the parliament as the expression of the will of the majority should determine which terminology a university professor uses in his lectures, that notion is simply wrong. I mean, it's very, very wrong. Why is it wrong? Well, because science and scientific discourse are not slaves to public opinion, but should be allowed to contradict beliefs commonly held, which may in the end lead to a correction of those beliefs, if they were wrong, to the benefit of society as a whole. I mean, that's, in a sense, that's the whole purpose of academia. Well, it's not the whole purpose, but it's quite a lot of the purpose of academia boils down to that part, basically. So hence, objecting to Professor Heslow's scientific conclusions on the grounds that they fail to comply with current legal terminology, whether this is true or not, is surely a symptom of a deep-seated intellectual failure. And the failure is not to see the point of academic activity in a way. Now, unsurprisingly, and now I come to my presentation, so don't worry. So Professor Heslow's actions are not only protected by traditional academic norms, but also, and for precisely this reason, by international agreements regarding the status of academic freedom. And one such document, which I really, really recommend, is to read, is the UNESCO recommendations concerning the status of higher education teacher personnel from 1997. And here you see one of its guiding principles. It's worth reading in its entirety. Institutions of higher education, and more particularly universities, are communities of scholars preserving, disseminating, and expressing freely their opinions on traditional knowledge and culture, and pursuing new knowledge without constriction by prescribed doctrines. The pursuit of new knowledge and its application lie at the heart of the mandate of such institutions of higher education. So here it's emphasized the importance of being able to express freely one's opinion within academia, and also the value of pursuing new knowledge without constriction by prescribed doctrines. So let's compare this statement by UNESCO, which again reflects the traditional academic norms, with Professor Heslow's situation. Now, when Professor Heslow freely expressed opinion, his right to free speech and inquiry was unfortunately not protected by the university, which instead decided to investigate him for possible discrimination. I think there's a clear clash here between the academic norm as represented by the UNESCO statement here and what actually happened in this case. And moreover, the university's interference stands in contrast, I believe, to the academic norm spelled out in Article 27 of the same UNESCO document. We don't have to read all this, but it also emphasizes the right without constriction by prescribed doctrine to freedom of teaching and freedom of discussion. And also freedom from institutional censorship is central here. But again, Professor Heslow can hardly be said to have been in a position to enjoy such freedom of institutional censorship. On the contrary, his institution required of him rather a particular way of expressing himself, a particular terminology, and his loyalty to a particular prescribed doctrine, in this case a gender doctrine. And finally, the norms constituting the fundamental academic principle of Lehrfreiheit, of freedom of teaching, are laid out in the next article in the same document. And again, we don't have to read all of this, but it emphasizes the right to teach without any interference. And it says that higher education teaching personnel, and professors in particular, should not be forced to instruct against their own best knowledge and conscience. But again, Professor Hessler was not granted the privilege of teaching without any interference. But his attempt to do so led again to him being subjected to a formal investigation into alleged discrimination. Now it's true that Professor Hessler has lately been allowed to give his lecture in its original form, but his authority has been undermined by the perceived necessity to have a supplementary lecture held by another teacher on gender perspectives. In another case, also reported by Academic Rights Watch, the foundation which I chair, Dr. Erik Ringmar, at the time a lecturer in political science, who described himself as being politically to the left, decided to cancel his course on this was a course on the modern history of conservative and fascist thought. So the cancellation came after the department introduced a rule that forces teachers to use gender quotas for course literature, whereby at least 40% of the literature should be written by female authors. As in Professor Hessler's case, the department's policy in this matter is based on the university's gender mainstreaming plan. In a sense, it comes from above. Now, the course was to be based on conservative and fascist primary literature from late 1800 and early 1900. Dr. Ringmar, however, was unable to find enough female conservative or fascist writers to fill the 40% quota. And in the end, they did manage to find one female writer who opposed women's suffrage, so the right for women to vote. However, the director of studies judged that the course would still not be approved by the department's literature committee. And indeed, the student representative subsequently criticized it for lack of focus on gender, unquote. A compromise was, however, reached to the effect that the course would be approved by the committee if Dr. Ringmar promised to include the work by Judith Butler, a radical feminist writer in the post-structuralist tradition. So he agreed to include this work by a book by Judith Butler, and then the course started. But then what happened was that Dr. Ringmar felt that there was no place for the book by Butler in that course on fascist thought, and therefore he simply chose to leave out the book from the actual course. And this decision in turn led to some students complaining to the department dean, and this time because the course didn't comply with the reading list. And at that point, Dr. Ringmar had had enough and decided to cancel the course altogether. It wasn't really possible to give the course he had intended to give due to this regulation. I think that the department's treatment of Dr. Ringmar is a further example of how teachers in the world of UNESCO are, quote, forced to instruct against their own best knowledge and conscience. And once more, as the effect of gender mainstreaming, in violation of the aforementioned Article 28 of the UNESCO. So I think these are quite clear cases, because if you can't even decide the literature list yourself as a teacher, then I mean, you really don't have control over that course in the way that the academic norms require you to have. Now, both the Hessler and the Ringmar case have been the subject of public debates, mainly in Sweden, but also internationally, and in many cases, public outrage. In his analysis, high-profile Swedish journalist Ivar Arpi used the Ringmar case as illustrating what it takes to be a precarious situation for academic freedom in Sweden, writing, quote, "This is just one example of academic freedom being traded for a specific vision of social justice, and similar processes are taking place across the country. This process, he continues, is called gender mainstreaming, and it threatens academic freedom at all Swedish universities," unquote. The university's handling of the Ringmar case was also criticized, among others, by German journalist Thomas Steinfeld. In his view, the case is one in which, quote, certified norm engineers attack the freedom of science in the name of the state, unquote. Now, interestingly, Judith Butler herself, and this was the feminist writer whose book Dr. Ingman was persuaded to include in the reading list, but then couldn't find a place for in the actual lectures. She was interviewed about the case in the Swedish Culture magazine. And in the interview, Butler, in fact, expresses great concern with the way in which her book was used in a particular case, observing that, quote, academic freedom recognizes the right of university teachers to conceive their courses in accordance with their own professional judgment, unquote. And she added that it is, quote, she is against attempts to force teachers to lecture on authors. So Judith Butler herself was entirely against including her book in this course in the way in which it happened. So let's see if you agree that something has gone wrong here, it might be interesting to think about what has gone wrong. So let's look at gender mainstreaming. So here is one idea, one quote on that phenomenon. So on this influential account, gender mainstreaming is a strategy that claims to make women's and men's experiences an integral dimension in the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of policies and programs. So one has to read that more than once in order to get the possible meaning that we can attach to that. But so it's better to look at exactly how this policy has been implemented in a concrete case. So a closer look reveals that the form of gender mainstreaming that was actually introduced at Swedish universities, and this was in the period of 2017 and 2019, so it's quite recent. It's actually much more radical than a policy simply requiring equal opportunity and equal treatment of women and men, which today is uncontroversial in many Western countries. But at least in theory, I mean, sometimes in practice, it's not really happening all the time. But the actual policy implemented is in fact a kind of identity politics. So I'm not aware if you know that concept, but the idea is that to protect a certain group of people in a way. So it's part of a mobilization for women as a group who are assumed to be disadvantaged and discriminated as a group in academia, if not visibly, so at least structurally. And this result is assumed to follow from research in gender studies, which by university administrations in Sweden now has been adopted as the preferred scientific framework for understanding sex and equality. Now, according to gender studies, sex is determined mainly or exclusively by social factors. Sex is often said to be socially constructed rather than being biologically constituted. However important the gender studies perspective is not the only perspective on sex and equality pursued in science. So here's another study, which an overview of work on sex and sex differences in academia, which I found useful. So there's actually a number of other disciplines studying sex rather from a biological perspective. So an overview of sex difference in science and mathematics found, for example, that males are consistently overrepresented among overachievers, but also among underachievers in science and math. And the study concluded that, and you see it here on the screen, that early experience, biological factors, educational policy, and cultural context affect the number of women and men who pursue advanced study in science and math, and that these effects add and interact in complex ways. In which case, they concluded that there are no single or simple answers to the complex question about sex differences in science and mathematics. And I think that could be extended to sex differences in other areas of academia, not only in science and mathematics. But my point is that if there's no single or simple answers, a purely social or power perspective on sex differences, such as the perspective normally pursued in gender studies, is insufficient to explain empirical data in these areas. So I'm not against the gender studies per se, and there's a lot of very good work in that area, but what I'm against is seeing it as providing the final truth about the sex and equality in the sciences. So hence one failure here is to base university policy on one research tradition, particular perspective on sex and gender as providing the final truth of the matter. The Heslow case in particular illustrates the academically unacceptable consequences of this decision, I believe. All right, but let's suppose we want to dig even deeper into this, into the causes of these, as I see it, academic failures. So how can it be that universities in Sweden and in other countries as well decided to accept gender mainstreaming plans that so obviously presuppose a particular scientific view accepted at a particular point in time as the one final truth of the matter at the expense of other views traditionally pursued at universities? There's a short answer to this, and that is that the gender studies happen to fit nicely into the political agenda of the left-wing parties in Sweden, a country priding itself for pursuing a feminist foreign policy. So I believe that without the support from the Swedish government, and in particular Social Democrats, gender studies would probably never have been any, or never have had rather, any major influence on universities' internal policies. And I've written a paper on this recently, which is in the reviewing process, where I've actually traced the decision process, and which comes from the Swedish government and then goes down, and then finally universities adopt these gender mainstreaming plans with a surprisingly radical content. And digging even deeper than this, then, Academic Rights Watch found, in fact, 10 causes of less than perfect academic freedom in Sweden. And many of these causes are interrelated, so they interact in complex ways, and many arguably apply to other countries as well. So I just read some of these. So one is the failure among decision makers to understand the concept of academic. So I think that the concept of academic freedom is widely misrepresented or misunderstood, especially by policymakers or university managers. Another thing is that we have politically appointed vice chancellors of universities. So I'm not sure about the case in South Africa, but in Sweden, vice chancellors of universities are finally appointed by the government, although the universities themselves can propose the vice chancellor. But you also have things like internal recruitment, which is not really meritocratic. You have lobbyists and special interest group, identity politics and radical forms of feminism, I've already talked about. Radical relativism, which I'm going to talk about soon. You have a political class without connections with academia. I'm not sure about the case of South Africa here, but in Sweden, I mean, the profession of a politician is basically started at a very early age, and it's not that they have other or studied academic subjects or anything like that. Rather, you grow into the party very early on. But one major factor is neoliberalism and new public management, which I believe are policies that are very destructive for academic freedom, but that's not the subject of today's talk. Insufficient legal protection of academic rights, and also culture emphasizing soft values, quality of life, equality, rather than competition and achievement. So all these things interact, and they explain why this is possible at all, why you get the Heslow case, why you get the ring matches. But since I'm running out of time now, I will focus on just one of these factors. And this factor will be the one of radical relativism. More precisely, its role in undermining academic freedom and the extent of its relativism cannot all be coherently pursued within academia. This is what I turn now. So if you look at freedom of speech, which I think is the most important part of academic freedom, there's an influential argument going back to John Stuart Mill. And this argument runs as follows. So a statement is either true or not true, Mill reasoned. If it is true, expressing it will cause more people to have true views, which is a good thing. If it's not true, an open debate will still make the true view less dogmatic. So we will embrace the actually true view in a more insightful and vivid way, and we will better understand why it is true. So whether or not the statement is actually true or not true, it's a win for society to have it openly expressed. So that's Mill's argument in a nutshell. There are also other arguments for freedom of speech, but I think this is a really fundamental argument. But this argument presupposes, of course, that we can legitimately speak of true and false statements. So you have to if you want to appreciate this argument, you have to think that there are true and false statements. Yet the widespread relativism at universities in Sweden and elsewhere claims that there is no truth, or that the truth is relative or contextual or whatever, and therefore less important. So if so, the perhaps strongest argument for freedom of speech fails, because again, the argument presupposes that we can speak of true and false statements legitimately. So for the relativist, if you're really and here I'm thinking of a radical relativist who denies truth or thinks it's a merely relative thing and so on. For the relativist, one who criticizes, for example, the research of others is a person who exercises illegitimate rather power and unjustifiably or out of rudeness harms others. The step is short to regard critical intellectuals as psychosocial problems in the workplace and to discipline them with reference to work environment or discrimination legislation. Now, something has gone wrong here, and relativism is, I believe, at least a part of the explanation, but there are also other parts of the full explanation. Now, humanists and philosophers included have unfortunately contributed to the spread of relativism, for example, in the form of certain types of extreme versions of postmodernism. This development has been welcomed by university management, who often have a strategic interest in toning down the search for truth and freedom of expression in favor of other short-term or political goals. So in this way, humanists and philosophers who have traditionally, in many cases, been critics of power are now often seen guests in the corridors of university management. Of course, there is a valuable insight in relativism that it's worth holding on to. This is that the truth is often difficult to find, and that one can be mistaken as to whether one has found it in a given case. This is, of course, entirely correct. And also that one should therefore rather cultivate an openness to revise even the most well-established or well-entrenched belief, if concrete reasons emerge that would make this necessary. Yet none of this is the same as saying that the truth doesn't exist, that it is relative, or that it cannot be the ultimate goal of science to find, or at least approximate or get close to the truth. This confusion is fatal, I think, and a factor that keeps relativism alive, even though it actually undermines itself. Because already the skeptics of antiquity realized that even the relativist himself or herself claims something as true, namely relativism, and that relativism is already for that reason contradictory and untenable. But there might be versions of relativism that can avoid this problem of being self-undermining, but I think that's the standard argument against relativism. Now, without the assumption of an objective truth, which we all strive to find and disseminate, research and teaching are fundamentally pointless activities. Academic environments where relativism has gained a foothold are therefore characterized by low energy and weak productivity. Because why bother when it's not so important to find the truth, or if there is no truth? So why care if there is no substantial truth to be found? And very little data is collected, and the standards for empirical evidence and rigorous argumentation are low. Instead, the argumentation tends to be strategically motivated by desire to confirm one's own preconceived notions and ideas, or to promote some kind of activist agenda or things like that. Now in Sweden, not least gender studies and pedagogy are at risk, although of course there is excellent research in these disciplines as well. But I believe that humanists and social scientists must once and for all overcome the kind of relativism that denies the pursuit of truth in important matters as our main scientific goal. Indeed, I believe the pursuit of objective truth is definitional of scientific activity, distinguishes it from other activities, such as fiction writing and other artistic activities, or again, various forms of activism. Now, clearing out all radical relativists who currently undermine the university's activities would itself be difficult to reconcile with academic freedom. But that's not what I'm recommending. That would be a horrible policy. So the initiative must come from the relativists themselves. So I believe the situation is similar to a priest losing her religious faith and choosing as a consequence to leave her profession. Just as the priest is free to be as unbound by religious doctrine as she likes, but importantly, once she has left the church, so too the relativist is free to be as relativistic as he likes, provided that it does not exercise this right in academia. So let me conclude now with what I have been discussing. So to illustrate the stakes involved, I've discussed two case studies in which academic rights were, in my view, violated in relation to academic norms, traditional academic norms, as well as international agreement, in this case, the recommendations from UNESCO. The direct cause of the violations were certain policies adopted by the university under the name of gender mainstreaming, and in particular, the policy to treat one particular scientific view as the one final answer to questions regarding sex, gender, and equality. This failure in turn has, as we saw, deep and complex underlying causes. One of which was the tendency to adopt a form of radical relativism according to which there is no objective truth, or some other version of that notion. If so, one of the main arguments for freedom of speech, the core idea of academic freedom, is effectively undermined. This was Mill's argument, which I told you about. And moreover, it becomes possible to view almost everything, including university policy, as but a matter of power relations and politics. Because if truth doesn't really matter, then everything is just politics and power and so on and so forth. In particular, it becomes possible to introduce more or less subtle forms of censorship and various quota policies that equally clash with academic rights. So I hope to have provided in this talk some reasons for thinking that this path is not one that benefits academic scholarship. As a consequence, nor does it, in my view, benefit society. Thank you very much for listening. And here's the beautiful city of Lund. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Olsson. What we're going to do now is we're going to turn over to Professor David Benatar, who's going to briefly respond and then throw a question back at you. But first, I'm going to introduce Professor David Benatar. He is Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Bioethics Center at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. His areas of research include moral and social philosophy, applied ethics, and some philosophy of law and philosophy of religion. He is the author of several books, including, most recently, The Human Predicament, published by Oxford University Press in 2017. Professor David Benatar, I hand it over to you.
Good, thank you very much. And thank you to Professor Olsson for his presentation. I am probably not the best person to be commenting on this paper because I largely agree with Professor Olsson's views, and I'm appalled by the violations of academic freedom that he's described. So my comments will be largely sympathetic ones. I'm pleased to see that there's an audience, and perhaps he will get more pushback from other people than he'll get from me. So I want to just say a few things in my brief response to Professor Olsson. First of all, I want to comment on something that he is not focused on in his current presentation. When I was first asked to respond to his presentation, I was given a chapter that he'd co-authored with Jens Steelhorst Sørensen. And this is an issue that arises here and is mentioned really only in a line in his presentation to us today. It's about the role of neoliberalism in the problems that we confront. One reason why I'm going to focus on this rather than on the relativism question is I'm not sure myself, I could be wrong about this, but I'm not sure myself to what extent relativism has the kind of currency now that it did a few decades ago. I certainly see, though, the other challenges that he's raising. Professor Olsson, in his paper, refers to neoliberalism as a problem, and more specifically to the implementation of what he and others have called the new public management, which he says pose threats to academic freedom. They refer to 3 M's, which are markets, managers, and measures. And my sense is that it's really only the first of these that can be pinned on neoliberalism. I think there is a way in which unregulated and underregulated markets can impinge inappropriately on academic freedom. Although, of course, centralized economies impinge on academic freedom in other ways and often more severe ways. But I just want to ask a question as to what extent he thinks really managers and measures are a uniquely neoliberal construct. I'm not saying they don't have neoliberal manifestations, but the idea of a manager and the idea of measures and using these within universities doesn't seem to me to be unique to neoliberalism. You can actually have totalitarian regimes that use managers and measures perhaps even more effectively in destroying academic freedom. Now, if we do recognize that, then that may be a way of addressing what he and his co-author call a paradox. And what they say is that paradoxically, even left-wing parties hail neoliberal government reforms as an instrument to implement their own agendas. I think when we see that the use of management and measures is actually a much more universal human phenomenon that arises in an array of political structures and political environments, then it becomes less paradoxical. We can see how people across the political spectrum would be very keen on using managers and measures in order to implement their particular views. So that's the one comment with a question about neoliberalism. Secondly, I wanted to say a little bit about South Africa. Obviously, Professor Olsson's paper is focused on the Swedish example, and it's always interesting to hear about what's going on in other countries. But since this is taking place in some sense in South Africa, I thought it might be worth speaking a little bit about what's going on here. And I must say, I have a much more pessimistic view than Dr. Singh seems to have about what's going on in South Africa. I think there have been very serious violations of academic freedom, although often they are going to be a lot more subtle than the cases that we've had presented, or if not more subtle, then certainly less public, which may be an indication of another kind of repression of academic freedom here. In other words, the violations that are taking place here are not getting the kind of press and coverage that they may be getting in Sweden and elsewhere. So without sort of trying to tally the similarities and the differences between the South African and Swedish case, I thought I might just step through some of the threats to academic freedom in South Africa, and you can draw your own conclusions about the similarities and differences with the Swedish experience. So what is the role of the state in interfering? Well, obviously, historically in South Africa during the apartheid era, the state was heavily involved in interference in the tertiary sector. And that actually led to a certain conception of academic freedom among the so-called open universities in South Africa. Some of this was spearheaded by the University of Cape Town Vice-Chancellor T.B. Davey, who spoke about the freedom to decide who will teach, who will be taught, what will be taught, and how it will be taught. I think what South Africans don't realize is that although we don't have anything like the interference of the apartheid era now, there is nonetheless a significant state influence today in those decisions. The state has very serious interests and strong agendas to influence those factors, all of those factors, in universities today. So you find that the South African universities are liable to the employment equity legislation, which gives very strong regulations regarding who may and may not be appointed, and therefore who may or may not be teaching. Similar points would apply to admission of students. If you look at the funding of research in South Africa, and I think this would be particularly true in the humanities, you're going to get strong agendas driving what research is done in universities. And then, of course, you've got the role of the state in the university governance. Now, let me say, of course, that I don't think that state involvement in state universities is per se problematic. If the state is using public resources in order to fund tertiary education, it's entirely appropriate that it has some role in that governance. But there is a fine line between the appropriate role and inappropriate interventions and interferences with tertiary education. And it certainly seems to me that we are seeing an increased government involvement and direction in university government. Certainly at the University of Cape Town, the representation of the Minister of Higher Education's on the University Council, the governing body, has recently increased in the number. The number of representatives nominated by the relevant minister has increased. That's an example, not bad per se, but it may have certain effects. Whether they are intended or otherwise. Another problem, I think, in South African universities are the internal threats to academic freedom. Professor Olsson did describe some of those within the Swedish experience, and sometimes that's the result of government appointments, perhaps in the Swedish case. But I think a lot of the threat to academic freedom within South Africa comes from within. And when I say within, not as a result of government appointments per se, but because of a congruence between the ideology of the ruling party and also the ideology that is dominant within the university. And so you see a lot of intolerance for non-mainstream views, and you see a lot of intellectual conformity, at least at the visible public level. I hasten to add that this particular seminar strikes me as a distinct exception to the rule. It's not often that we see a seminar of this kind these days in South Africa. And if you do have something vaguely about academic freedom, it's unlikely that people advancing the views of Professor Olsson or the ones that I'm suggesting are ones that are going to be heard at all, let alone being dominant. So I think that's a very serious threat. You've got people either internalizing the pressures around them or self-censoring, even though they don't have the views of the prevailing kind. And then, of course, we do have a problem of managerialism here. And I think that facilitates both state interference and also the internal threats. So one way in which you can have a threat to academic freedom is the political influence coming down through management onto the university as a whole, but it also can be that internally leaders are generated that then manage a particular ideology and enforce the conformity that I was speaking about earlier. So that's the second point. And then finally, I wanted to say something about the limits of academic freedom. So both in Sweden and in South Africa, it seems the state poses some kind of a threat to academic freedom, despite allegedly guaranteeing it. So in South Africa too, we've got a protection of academic freedom enshrined in the law, but notwithstanding that, there are these threats. But I think it's helpful to think about a theoretical scenario where the broader society and the state is not posing a threat to academic freedom, but there are threats to academic freedom coming from within the university. And we need to at least acknowledge the possibility that there may be scenarios in which the state is not a threat to academic freedom, but actually a guarantor of academic freedom. So imagine some sort of repressive university regime where freedom of expression was being prevented in some or other way. And the state stepped in order to protect the free speech and the academic rights of academics. State interference per se needn't be bad. If it's there to prevent something of that kind, if it's there to prevent discrimination, that may indeed be appropriate. Now, of course, we very quickly come to murky and difficult waters here, because you can have conceptions of discrimination, and the state can be interfering under the guise that it is countering discrimination, when in fact that's not what it's doing. It may in fact be perpetuating or reinforcing or committing another kind of discrimination. So there are many things to be said about this. I don't pretend to be saying all of them now, but I just wanted to signal this potential benefit of the state in protecting, being a guarantor of academic freedom. So I'll leave it there, and I would be appreciative if Professor Olsson could address that question really about neoliberalism if he would like to. And then perhaps I'll say some things later in response to the comments from the floor. Thank you very much.
Yes,
thank you
very much, Professor Benatar. This is extremely interesting for me to hear. And I appreciate your questions very, very much. Let me go to the first point about the neoliberalism. The paper you referred to is a paper which is situated in the context of a Swedish situation. So then, I mean, totalitarianism isn't really a threat in today's Sweden, and therefore, although you're right that I mean, the problem of managers and measures and so on, they are not unique at all to neoliberalism, but they also could equally well be employed by a totalitarian state. But since the context of that paper was the Swedish situation, we hopefully safely could disregard that possibility. So the idea here is that if you look at the ideal university from a neoliberal perspective, it's actually very similar to the ideal university from a totalitarian perspective. So as you rightly point out, so because you have the idea is that you have a kind of a line of command structure. So you have the vice chancellor on top, and then you have line managers, I mean, below the vice chancellor. And rather than having a collegial decision-making bodies and things like that. which is actually required also by the UNESCO document I referred to. So, and that's very similar to, if you go back to take an extreme case to the German situation in the 1930s, that was also exactly the reform which were introduced then in a totalitarian setting. And of course, you have the government on top of all that, and then the vice chancellor appointed by the government and so on and so forth. So it's the structure of the totalitarian university and the neoliberal university is actually extremely similar. And concerning measures, you're right again. I mean, but let me say first of all that there's no problem of measuring things in itself, in my view. I mean, the problem arises when you start thinking of measures as capturing the whole of what is being measured. So let's think of what is being measured as the quality of research or something like that. And of course, I'm all for looking at citations and measuring all that, but these measures, they don't exhaust what quality is. So I think the problem here is, I mean, it becomes a problem when you start thinking of measures as measuring the whole of what is being measured, rather than being simply an indicator of something, like an indicator of research quality or what have you. But you're right. I mean, totalitarian regime could also use measures in various ways. So that's not at all unique to the neoliberalism. So several issues here that I hope I could separate clearly enough. Yes, and what you tell me about the South African situation is also very, very interesting. And so what is good about Sweden, I think, is that we have a free press, which is also quite interested in these debates. And so they have a lot of editorials discussing the university situation and often being on the sides of the academics. So there's a very lively discussion in Sweden. But having said that, I would say that a talk like the one I'm giving today wouldn't be easy to give in Sweden either. It would be, I mean, there's actually a debate on academic freedom in the Swedish parliament today, and which I wasn't invited to, for instance, although I am some kind of a major figure in that particular field in Sweden. So usually a debate would be conducted on very abstract level, and there would be no examples, and everyone would agree that the problem is elsewhere, but not in Sweden. That's the typical dialectic of such a debate in Sweden. So I think that's quite similar to what you describe as the South African situation. Yeah, I also agree that the threat to academic freedom is often coming from within academia. And in Sweden, I mean, most of the universities were created in the 60s. And this was also a time where the left wing policies were very strong in Sweden and elsewhere. So many university teachers came from that tradition, and then they have occupied central places within the university. So we have a very strongly left-wing leaning university in Sweden. And although if you look at the population at large, it's almost equally comprised of left-wingers and right-wingers. So there's a peculiar kind of representation in academia. And of course, now we also have a left-wing government. So what you described from South Africa is very similar to here, that we have a majority from academia actually agreeing with the government policies. And they don't have no problem at all with certain what I think are very extreme left-wing policies. And finally, I want to address what you said about the state being a kind of a guardian of academic freedom. And in Sweden, that will be difficult because the way in which vice chancellors are appointed, because as I mentioned, they are appointed by the state or by the government. So it's practically impossible to have a completely different view of the university, and still be appointed vice chancellor. Believe me, I have tried. So you're simply not even considered if you're not clearly belonging to the government ideology. And I should say I'm not a right-wing person either. I'm just somewhere in the middle, I believe. Yeah, so thank you very much for these comments, and I hope I have responded to some of the remarks you made.
Thank you. But I think we should open to the floor now, and perhaps I'll comment further later.
Thanks, Professor Olsson and Professor Benatar. So we have quite a few panelists, quite a few attendees in general. What we usually like to do is give students, so that could be postgraduate students, could be undergraduate students, the first round of questions. So if you are a student of any kind, you may raise your hand, raise your virtual hand. You can also use the comments box, the chat box. I'm hoping that you're all familiar with Zoom. I see.
Sorry, Ashil, can
Yes?
I just step in? Because everybody is panelists, they can't raise their hand. So the thing is, they can either type a question in the Q&A, or they can open their video and then you can give them an opportunity to speak.
Okay, thank you for that, Alrina. So I hope everyone heard that, just not all at once, please. So I'm still waiting for students. I see a question from someone who is was a brilliant student, but is past the student stage. So I'll give her a couple more minutes before I get to her. But if you are an official student, you may get the first round of questions. I'm looking for anyone's video or microphone. I hear someone. Clarice Murray, go ahead.
Hello, I wanted to ask, so thank you for your talk. I'm not sure I understood correctly the first example you gave, where the lecturer was, the students complained that he was discriminating in his lecture, what he was teaching. And then you said that that was undermining his freedom of speech. I wanted to ask about the difference of freedom to speech and freedom to a platform, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it is very important in academia that lecturers should be able to, or researchers should be able to write whatever they want in their articles. But I think it's a different story about when they're, what they can teach to a class, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that certain anti-discrimination policies also do in a way protect another kind of academic freedom, because if a lecturer is teaching something that is going to contribute to discrimination, one group being less likely to be listened to, that kind of undermines their freedom to speak and be listened to. For example, if a policy is being taught that can undermine the rights of transgender people, as you mentioned, then maybe that would shift the consciousness, or like the opinion, the public opinion, to not want to listen to what that a transgender person might want to say on the matter or contribute. So I just want to ask what do you think?
Yeah. No, but I mean, people react differently to this example, and some people react the way you do, so, but I mean, let me put it like this. I mean, it wasn't the case that the student was not allowed to speak freely during class, for instance. So this was something which came up during class, and there was a discussion in the Q&A between the student and the teacher. And the student asked about this, and the teacher responded. And so in this sense, there was no violation of freedom of speech in the classroom situation. But yeah, then the issue is, I mean, how much weight should you give to the fact that someone might be offended by a professor teaching what he or she believes to be the truth of the matter? And how much should you think about that factor in contrast to the traditional academic norm of what I call Lehrfreiheit, I mean, the norm of being able to teach what from your own best knowledge or best and conscience. So, and here I would side in favor of the latter. I mean, I think that the academic norm here has a stronger democratic standing than being, in the case of conflict, very attentive to various people's feelings or impressions, or even people who get feel hurt or somehow by this. So I think that the trade-off, I mean, there is a conflict here. I mean, obviously there's a conflict, but so we have to decide where should the emphasis be? And I suggest that democratically, I mean, the academic norms are more fundamental than the norm of attending to people's feelings about various subjects. So that's my basic response. But yeah.
Okay, thank you. Can I respond a little bit more, or should we move on? I don't know.
You may, Clarice. Sorry, I was muted.
Okay, right. So I think one thing I would say is I think a lot of these policies are not just to prevent people from being offended. I think they're also to prevent them from having like their rights eroded. It's not just about someone being offended is not the worst possible consequence of someone saying or teaching a discriminatory idea. That's all I'd say. But thank you for your reply.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I mean, the right not to be offended, and is it's a problematic. I mean, there is such a right in most legal or many legal systems, including the Swedish legal system. But it's always a way. It's always a matter of weighing the one against the other. I mean, so one has to be thinking about what is the more fundamental idea. And again, I think that in this case, academic freedom trumps other concerns. And well, having said that, I would emphasize then that the student was allowed to freely express her opinion in the class, and there was no violation of that sort. There's also the risk of a slippery slope here. So once you start being very concerned about not offending anyone, then gradually it becomes more and more difficult to teach things that might be controversial or problematic from certain perspectives. So I think ideally one should never enter that slippery or that plane. I mean, which tends to go downwards, and in the end, there's no real freedom of speech anymore. Yeah, but thanks for your comment.
Thank you. I see that we have two questions / comments in the chat box. One from Christo Lombard, and then we have one from Abraham Toby. Let's go firstly because it's in chronological order. Christo Lombard says, a remark, if I may please, on the difficulty between relativism and the pursuit of truth. I don't see them as fully opposites. One, the argument of relativism that there are no firm truths is in itself its own firm truth. Relativism thus has not let go of the idea of an absolute position or a zero position, which it then seeks to pursue by all means. And then two is the idea of objective reality, which is simply laid bare by scholarship, has been shown not to work well either, and earlier thus in some ways preparing the way for relativism. For example, Thomas Kuhn with his concepts of paradigms, and Kurt Lewin with his almost slogan that there is nothing as practical as a good theory. Theory guides understanding. Both approaches have a holy grail to pursue, while at the same time having a weak point on which it can implode. Perhaps the sense of insecurity both approaches sublimate by its firm conviction that it is foundationally correct, explains the vehemence of these debates, at least in part. Prof. Olsson, okay, I'm not sure if you can read that chat.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can read it here. Yeah, let me discuss the first point. So regarding relativism, yeah. I mean, it depends on what kind of relativist you are. I mean, you can be a relativist regarding, let's say you have a relativist position according to which everything is relative and there is no absolute truth, there is no non-relative truth. And it's so let's say everything is just relative to your community or your culture or things like that. So, and that's perfectly possible position, I guess. But then the question arises then, what happens to relativism itself? Is that also then just a statement which is done from a certain perspective and from a certain context and so on? And of course, then you can take two positions then. So one would be saying that no, relativism is the exception, so to speak, of that. This is the one single truth, which is somehow absolutely true. And the other position would be no, okay, so relativism is in the same position as everything else. It's also only relative. But let's say, I mean, it's only relative then. So why should we care about relativism if it's only relatively true? On the other hand, if it's absolutely true, so how can it be that just that this position happens to be absolutely true and nothing else is? I mean, so in my view, there's a coherence problem in the whole idea of relativism. So here I'm thinking, I mean, it's very important here to know that I'm thinking of relativism as in an extreme form. You know, it's not just that you have a relativism regarding views in a certain field or something like that. That's not the way I think it. So I think of relativism as a kind of global statement regarding all truths or almost all truths. So that's my response to the first question. I'm not sure about the second question here, but you're right that there are the people in the philosophy of science who have had the extreme, I mean, relativistic views about various things. And so the problem here is how far can you go if you want to be a relativist and still be in academia, remembering that the main academic goal is to find the truth and to find knowledge. And I'm not going to decide that issue now. So I'm not giving you the line. I mean, where the line is to be drawn, basically between a kind of coherent relativism and an incoherent relativism. I don't. That would require much more discussion than I can produce at the moment. But I think there is a line to be drawn. I think there's a relativism which is so relative in the sense that it's not you can't really pursue it within academia. Was that all, or did I miss something here? There was also a question, perhaps, or should I continue reading here, or should you take over, Achille?
I think we can go to the next one. Abraham Toby, you can see it on your side.
So he writes that to say that the academic norms are more fundamental. What is your reason for that?
And I think that's related to Carlis's
yeah, it's related to that question. So what I'm comparing with here is the norm which says that you shouldn't hurt anyone willfully. And so I'm saying that academic norms are more fundamental in the sense that they are fundamental in a democracy in a way which the other norm isn't. So it's and a sign of that is that it's protected by the UNESCO, for instance, and other international organizations. Also on the EU level, there are a lot of agreements on academic freedom. The norm not to be offended doesn't have the same statute or the same status as academic freedom in this regard.
I think I should read the questions because this is obviously going to be played. It's live streaming via YouTube and Facebook, so people on those platforms won't be able to see the questions. Sure. So the next question is also from a student. It's from Shanae. I think we find ourselves, and I quote, I think we find ourselves in a situation where political correctness is seen as the most important, or at least one of the most important values in society, which leaves us with a problem where academia is concerned, as you have articulated. My question is, how can we combat this in academia so that it does not simply become another cog in the political machine? How do we preserve the value of truth and critical inquiry in academia in the current climate?
Yeah, that's also a very good question, and thank you for that. Yeah, so the way, here I can tell you about our experience, or my experience in Sweden. So when we found out that there were problems with academic freedom and political correctness in Sweden, then what we started to do was to actually monitor the situation. So we founded this kind of academic watchdog, Academic Rights Watch, which main purpose is to document what we believe to be violations of academic freedoms. And our gold standard here is the UNESCO document I alluded to earlier. So what we do is basically that we write about these cases and we document them. And the good thing about Sweden, and I'm not sure about the situation in South Africa, but in Sweden, almost all public documents are, or all government documents or university documents are basically public documents. So you can ask for them and you can put them online. So what we do is that we give our view of the case, and then we have links to documentation, and then people might decide for themselves whether it was actually a violation or it wasn't a violation. But this has been, I would dare to say, a rather effective way of putting the light on people who do not always respect academic freedom. Of course, this strategy presupposes a certain legislation around free speech. So free speech is very well protected in Sweden. So you're allowed to criticize openly government officials if they have a certain standing in the hierarchy. So you wouldn't be allowed to do this for, I mean, a lecture or anything like that. But if it's, let's say it's a university manager who's done something wrong, then academically wrong, then it's actually possible to publicly write about this. And of course, that person might, him or herself, want to comment, and we take in comments from the person that we focus on as well. So that I think that putting the sunlight on this is the most effective strategy. And in the United States, there is a similar watchdog called the FIRE. I can't recall now what it's the abbreviation of, but and they do a similar work where they simply write about these cases and they publish them and so on and so forth. But what we also do is that we write opinion pieces in the Swedish media, perhaps not about single cases, but about more structural problems. And so on. There are various ways that you can act, but you have to be determined, and you have to be willing to devote a certain amount of time to this, because it's not, in a way, it's time consuming. And I also think that you have to have a certain academic position and a status in order to do this, because if I were a junior fellow, I would probably not be engaged in what I do now, because it would be much too politically sensitive, and it would probably have an effect on my career. But now I'm a university professor, so I feel that I can do this service to what I see as a service to the profession and also to society.
Thank you. So there's a follow-up from Abraham Toby. I see that, and I also note the hand earlier by Veli. But before we continue, I just want to point out something about the term political correctness. It was, it's not a criticism of the questioner, but it's a term that we use, I shouldn't say we, it's a term that is used, and it's not often interrogated. So as I understand it, what is now called political correctness is something that is, it is something used by, and this is not meant to be anything more than a descriptive analysis of what's going on, just describing what I see. It depends on where you fall on the political spectrum, or if you see yourself as belonging to any part of the political spectrum. You might be a philosopher who is outside of that. But as I see the political correctness, these ideas are coming from a certain part of the spectrum. They're coming from the left, and not only the left, maybe many of the ideas extreme left. But that's not how it started. It started obviously on the left, but then political correctness was a kind of way of criticizing those movements from the left. And now what I see is the political correctness has become cleansed and used as something that's good. It used to be an insult when I was younger. When we said something that's not politically correct, it was said as a kind of criticism of being pushed in a certain direction. Now it's used as if we can't do that because it's not politically correct. What is politically correct is good, but and correct me if I'm wrong. There's always a certain political slant coming in through political correctness, right? You might not see yourself as left, you might not see yourself as right, you might see yourself as centrist or someone beyond it. But when you're being politically correct, you are coming from a certain spectrum, or certain part of the political spectrum. So it's not neutral, politically neutral to be politically correct. I don't abuse my privileges too much. I want to go to Abraham Tobey and then to Veli. So Abraham Tobey's response, which is, I'm going to read it out, and I quote, I don't think the point is simply about offending someone else, but about being unjust to them by perpetuating ideas that are discriminatory, for instance. Wouldn't the requirements for justice trump the academic norms you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, everyone has to think about, and this is a variation of what I said before, but you have to think about what is more important in this case. And so here you have a professor lecturing on a certain topic in which he is an expert. And it happens to be the topic of sex and biological foundation of sex. And that professor, we have to assume, gives his opinion on, I mean, scientifically informed opinion on that topic. And let's say now that this is seen as offending someone or seen as somehow unjust. And I mean, to me, then this might be something which is unfortunate and it is regrettable, but it's not something which would. I mean, I think we wouldn't be well advised to have some rule saying that the information we provide at lectures must not be offensive to anyone. I mean, that would be too much of a limitation on the freedom of teaching. So it would actually hamper teaching. It would provide. I mean, well, it would seriously conflict with the freedom of speech that I believe that every teacher needs to have in academia. And again, once you start making those kind of taking those kind of concerns, where does it end? I mean, where does it end by someone feeling violated, feeling offended, or where there's no end to that process as I see it. So one better not start on that path, as it were.
Ashil, may I come in on this?
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
This is Professor David Benatar speaking.
Thank you. So both this question and an earlier one have raised the question of offense. And I think it might be better to, they've tried to guide us away from speaking about offense to speaking about injustice. Now, my worry with this is that you can present something as an instance of discrimination and then use that as a justification for silencing somebody. So I don't want to speak about it in terms of offense. I want to take the argument on its own merits and say what you got here is an instance of an injustice. So why shouldn't that trump the academic freedom? Well, here's why not. Let's imagine that I were to say that the idea that's just been presented, namely that an injustice trumps one's right to freedom of expression, is itself something that can lead to discrimination against people who want to express certain views. Mm-hmm. And therefore that view shouldn't even be expressed. In other words, the criticism shouldn't even be expressed. I think you'd very quickly see that Abraham Tobey, for example, should be perfectly at liberty to say what he's just said. If I were to try to silence him on the grounds that that comment could lead to discrimination against people who want to express alternative views, we'd land up in a mess. So he should be able to express that view. Somebody else should be able to express another view, but it doesn't mean that you're going to silence somebody on the basis of an allegation of discrimination. He's responding now, Abraham Tobey. He says, is your point that it's okay to say discriminatory things? Well, let me say a few things about that. First of all, there's a question about whether something is actually discriminatory or it's merely alleged to be discriminatory. And that's part of the problem that we're dealing with here, is that you can have competing views about whether something is discriminatory. And if all you need is one person saying that it is to shut everybody else down, then you can have a society in which certainly nothing unorthodox can be said.
So may I fill in
on that?
Another thing
is, sorry, when you say that, is it okay to say discriminatory things? There's a difference between is it morally okay and ought you to have the legal freedom to do it? And I think, yes, you certainly should have the legal freedom to do it. So that's part of the deal here, is that we can say things even when we are wrong in saying them. Is it morally okay? No, I don't think it is if it's really discrimination. But that again is where you're going to have a difference of opinion.
Yeah, so perhaps I agree completely with what Professor Benatar says there. And so my idea is that, I mean, if someone is so easily offended and can't take a professor's view on a sensitive subject, then perhaps that person isn't fit for academia simply because, in my view, I know this sounds strong and perhaps intolerant, but I don't think it is. But I mean, in my view, the university is a place where the truth should be our guiding motive. So we should be all seeking the truth together. And the truth is sometimes disturbing, it might be offending and so on, but if you can't take that, then you have to seriously consider whether the university is actually the right place for you. So then, and the other response that I have is that if you look at the situation in the US now, where they have huge problems of deplatforming and all that. So I think if you look at that situation, many people in Sweden say that, no, we don't want to have that here, simply. We want to have something which guards us against that kind of situation. So my view has been that we should adopt what is called the Chicago Declaration, which simply says that, and this has been adopted now by some 50 American universities. And the basic idea is that we shouldn't have deplatforming at university. We should allow people to talk. We should be cultivating our resistance to being offended all the time by this and that. And because that, I think, is part of the university experience too. So when you come out of the university, if you're a student, then you should be a person who can take the truth, and even if it's a disturbing truth.
Thank you. So I'm going to. We have a robust and thriving discussion going on in the chat group. I'm going to read them, then I'm going to turn to Veli, who's been waiting quite a long time to ask a question or give a comment. So the first response chronologically would be, I don't think legality should trump morality. That was to Prof. David Benatar's comment. I'm just going to read these and we can discuss them later if there's time, but there's about 5 minutes. And then Clarice Murray says, I think there's a difference between legal freedom and freedom to saying something in front of a group of students without consequence. We should not equate these. Abraham Tobias says, Jim Crow law and apartheid were legal. That doesn't make them okay. And Mona Lisa Dladla says, we should have the freedom to say things. I 100% agree with Prof. Benatar. However, there should also be legal consequences for hate speech. And then we have Christo Lombard says, there's an old saying on accepting diversity within the university to a far-reaching extent. That each university should have at least one professor who believes that the earth is flat. Okay, so let's leave that as it stands. I think that the last one is calling for plurality of opinions, if I read it correctly. But we're going to go to someone who's been waiting quite a long time, and that's Veli Matova.
Hi, Erik, and hi, David. Welcome
hi.
to you, Jay. My
Good
question
to
is
see you.
addressed to my question is addressed to Erik. I'm still recovering from the last fight I had with David in Cape Town in March. But I guess we all kind of pushing you guys on the same thing. I just want to do it slightly differently. So first, let me say that I completely agree with you about the relativism point, right? And academia is about truth, but it seems to me that has a natural implication that because of that, we shouldn't be teaching stuff like fascism and idiotic ideas about gender and sex, right? Because we're trying to converge towards the truth. So that's the one point. And the second one, which is related to the stuff that people have been pushing you both on. And I agree with David that the issue is not, and with Abe, that the issue is not offense, it's about injustice. It seems to me that the Article 28 that you cited to us was, I would have put the emphasis in a different place. So it said that we have the right to to teach without any interference, which is where your emphasis was.
Yeah.
But the next clause says subject to accepted professional principles, including professional responsibility.
Sure.
And I think this is the thing that I would have emphasized, because I think that the disagreement can be rephrased either as an issue between whether academic freedom trumps other things, or an issue about what our professional responsibility is. And I think part of this professional responsibility is not to marginalize and to exclude some of our students. And some of these ideas that you say people have been unfairly dismissed for would marginalize most of my class,
Okay.
as well as their knowledge systems.
All right.
Yeah,
so it's, I mean, yeah, so I can refer to other parts of the UNESCO document here, and so there's a part there which is also very interesting and very readable on the responsibilities that academics have, and I think I agree completely. I think that the responsibilities are as important as the freedom. So academic freedom is indeed a freedom with responsibility, or with so it's so the basic idea is that people should be allowed academic freedom in academia or as a university professor, provided that they are here to proper conduct in the sciences. And by this is meant mainly that they don't, commit scientific fraud and things like that. But there's also a clause in this UNESCO document on the fact that you shouldn't discriminate or treat students differently and things like that. So that is also an important part, and all good academics have that in the backbone somehow, that and they know exactly how to do that without offending anyone. But so I think of that kind of condition, that you shouldn't discriminate. I think that's that should be taken on a different level than in the cases I told you about. So I think about cases, for instance, that you don't grade someone's exam differently because of the color of a person's skin, or I mean, that's what I imagine they meant when they wrote that part of the UNESCO declaration. They didn't think of the case where you shouldn't speak what you think of the truth as being the truth, because it would be in some sense offensive or unjust or unjust. So that's not the way I interpret the UNESCO recommendations, and it's also not the way I interpret, and this is more important, and it's not the way I interpret the traditional academic norms around this. I think that although you're right about there being a responsibility not to discriminate, I think that has to do with much more concrete situations, like the grading of exams, the allowing who is to speak in the classroom, and all that. So all that should be guided by the principle of equal treatment. That's for sure. So I don't think that's clause as covering a case where you're not allowed to speak the truth, what you can think of the truth as the truth, because it will, in some sense, be seen as offensive by someone. So that's not my interpretation of that part of academic freedom, and I think it would be unfortunate if we interpret it in that way. So I think that the crucial thing here is to think of academia as a place for seeking the truth, and you have to somehow strengthen your character if you have a problem with that. And perhaps you might think twice whether one should even be in academia if you can't handle the truth also on sensitive matters. But of course, you can always dispute. You're always allowed to dispute what someone is presenting as the truth, and it is freedom of speech for students as well as for teachers. So there's no problem on that level. But yeah, I hope I've made myself clear on that point.
Yes, thank you, Professor. We've gone over time, but I ask permission from everyone if you would mind, if anyone would mind going 5 minutes over time, just to finish off this thought.
Sure.
There's a question in the chat group that actually speaks to I think, Veli's concern, and it might help us tie up this discussion, especially for a local audience. I'm going to read it so that everybody hears it on YouTube and Facebook. Thank you, Professor Olsson, for this presentation. By the way, this is from a PhD student at our department, Amara Esther Ani. Thank you, Professor, for this presentation, but I am wondering how you would respond to a critic who sees the whole idea of academic freedom as a tool that can be used by some persons in the West to colonize the academic space of others, especially that of Africa. This is because academic freedom, in terms of research, would give some scholars in the West the latitude to portray the African worldview without proper understanding of African culture, language, knowledge, and belief systems. So just to maybe summarize that. So the concern is, Professor, we at in South Africa, specifically in at least my department, there's a we have a plurality of traditions, basically, and the concern coming from the question is the whole idea of academic freedom going to undermine some or most or even all of those academic traditions apart from one?
Yeah, so I don't know the situation in South Africa well enough to give a very detailed response to that, but I think it would be unfortunate if academic freedom were seen as in that way, because as I see academic freedom, it's something which protects our basic human instinct to seek the truth, which is something which is common to us all, and it doesn't have to do with race, it doesn't have to do with color, it doesn't have to do with sex in a major way. And it's I think it's Aristotle who says that human beings by nature want to know. I think that's the whole idea of academia. But of course, academia can be misused for various purposes, and I'm all against that. So if academia loses sight of truth and loses sight of this basic human need to understand the world, I mean, that's something I will surely be very critical to. But I cannot really comment on the local case in South Africa because I have too little understanding. I would like to learn more, and I would like to visit South Africa, but I know so little, so I can't do more than I have just said.
Yeah, you were due to visit us, as I mentioned earlier, and then the pandemic happened.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Professor David Bennett. Do you want to say one last word before we log off?
Sorry, thanks. No, I think we don't have enough time to address many of the issues that have been raised, but I'm grateful to you for organizing this seminar. I think we need lots more discussions of this kind because it's clear the issues need further probing.
Thank you. Thank you for responding, and thank you, Professor Olsson. Do you want to say something to conclude?
I just want to thank for all the very interesting questions, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar.
Thank you.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for giving us your talk and for engaging with us. Before we all log off, I want to thank the UGA Library team for the excellent work they're doing to ensure that we are still online during this difficult period. Thank you, Professor David Benatar. Thank you, Professor Olsson. Thank you, UGA Library team. And thank you everyone for joining us and for engaging with us. And I want to end actually with a comment from one of our students, Mona Lisa Dladla, because she's going to summarize things up in a very nice way for us. She says, and I quote, "This is an important debate for philosophy in particular because we, especially at UJ, are taught to suspend our beliefs and evaluate the arguments. This is academic freedom, the ability to rationally evaluate difficult subjects. To do that, we need to put our feelings aside." Thank you, everyone. Have a beautiful day and stay safe.
You too. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.